So here, let's begin to turn our attention from rape law to people who commit the act of sexual assault and rape. And so let's review rape myths. Recall that rape myths were these sets of beliefs that justify sexual assault and rape by men of women, usually in a patriarchal society. So based on the quote unquote real rape scenario, we know that rapists aren't strangers most of the time. They're not jumping from bushes or dark alleys most of the time and simply assaulting women that they don't know. So contrary to popular belief, rapists are not motivated solely by sexual desire. And so these misunderstandings of how rape occurs have resulted in two kind of common stereotypes about rapists, and these are derived from rape myths. And so the first one is the misunderstood offender. So this is where a perpetrator becomes involved in a sexual assault or in an allegation of sexual assault because the circumstances were beyond his control. There were misunderstandings or defective communication. The victim used nonverbal signals to lead him on to believe that what he was doing was okay. And so the defense to the misunderstood offender is this: if you put any other rational man, traditionally it's a man in this position of an alleged sexual assault, if you put any other rational man in this position, in the exact same position, in the exact same circumstance, he would have acted just the same, right? He would have received the same signals and he would have stayed the same course that resulted, unfortunately, in the sexual assault, in this case, most likely of a woman. So that's the misunderstood offender. So they didn't pay attention to signals. There was some sort of quote unquote defective communication. So what happens here is consent was usually not received, right, verbally and explicitly. So that receiving consent, right, is the ultimate defense so that no one becomes a misunderstood offender. So that's one type of stereotypical offender. The second type of stereotypical offender is the sex starved offender. This is where the offender has an insatiable sexual drive, right? They have this need to commit sex acts and gratify themselves. So offenders are portrayed as sex fiends, sex maniacs, sexual psychopaths. Maybe today we would label them as sex addicts, but that doesn't necessarily give them an excuse to harm. So sex starved offenders, right, in a typical real rape scenario, right, this is the person jumping out of the bush or coming out at the dark alley at the woman, right? That is this kind of offender, the stranger that's hurting someone. Now, a sex starved offender can also be an acquaintance or even a spouse or long term boyfriend or girlfriend. So the sex starved offender stereotype applies to people in long term relationships where there is potentially a lack of sexual relationship, and their sex drive and the fact they have this need for gratification and this unfulfilled desire leads them to commit this act against their partner. And so that's an example of a sex starved offender in a relationship in a less traditional sense. But either way, rape myths inform these stereotypes and generally work to excuse these people's behavior, right? The misunderstood offender and the sex starved offender. Now, also previously in another lesson, we talked about specific risk factors that can lead to rape and sexual assault. And so I just want to review those here and move on as explanations for their behavior. Again, as part of the review, these are some of the most well documented risk factors. And rarely do they act alone. Sometimes or oftentimes they act in combination with one another. So we'll start with hostile masculinity, right? This is referred to sometimes in the literature you'll see it as hostile masculinity syndrome. Sometimes it's just trait hostility, meaning that the person just has an overly high level, uh, or excuse me, overly high base level of aggression, whether that be verbal or physical. And so this can result in terms of sexual assault via attitudes and emotions. So, uh, in terms of in this way, the hostile offender, where the person that has the hostile trait, whether they you call it hostile masculinity syndrome, or just high trait hostility, right? So they're aggressive, distrustful, insecure when it comes towards dealing with other people, and especially women. So we're talking about male offenders here, because most documented sexual assault convictions, arrests deal with men perpetrators. So these feelings are accompanied by usually some sort of other patriarchal belief about how women are inferior. So like they have high rape myth acceptance. Uh, you might consider them misogynists, like women haters. So these attitudes that go along with their hostility uh, combine to lead them to a sexual assault. And so the second set of conditions with hostile masculinity is the desire to control and dominate women. And so this is something we'll talk about a little later. This desire to control and dominate women. So when this is combined with someone who has a high base level of trait hostility, right? There's the use of force, whether it be verbal, physical, or both. And so when you combine these two, there's this added gratification or drive to control women as part of a base dimension of their personality or how they relate with people in the real world. So this is hostile masculinity is a strong predictor of sexual assaults or rape. So aggressive sexual beliefs. So closely related to hostile masculinity are these beliefs. Um, they include attitudes supportive of aggression, use of force, coercion, humiliation, or violence and sexuality. So you can see where somebody who has a high base level trait hostility would automatically almost have these attitudes or beliefs. And so even though someone doesn't have trait hostile masculinity, excuse me, trait a high level of trait level hostility, they may have these attitudes which are predictors or set someone along a path more likely to commit a sexual assault. And so attitudes that kind of go along with this is get a woman drunk and she'll let you do whatever you want. So that would be one kind of aggressive sexual belief. So oftentimes these types of beliefs are linked to pedophilia, sadism, masochism. And remember that sexual sadism takes place when an individual receives pleasure from the psychological or physical suffering from another person. So sexual masochism, on the other hand, involves receiving sexual pleasure and gratification as a result of receiving psychological, physical suffering and pain. There's a lot of research that demonstrates that people subscribing to these aggressive sexual beliefs are more likely to commit sexual assault. It's been argued that viewing adult pornography may be symptomatic, not a cause of aggressive sexual beliefs. So, evidence for this relationship is kind of mixed. So, early research claimed that pornography predisposes some men to want to rape women or intensifies that desire to rape or commit sexual assault among men. But more recent evaluations, as we've discussed, reveal that pornography consumption is uh, weakly related to sexual assault, the commission of a sexual assault. So, engaging in frequent casual sex or the expectancy of impersonal sex is associated with sexual aggression. We've also discussed this previously. So, a recent study of college men found that high levels of impersonal sex combined with high trait level hostility predicted sexual aggression among those men. So this is kind of that individual difference slash risk category of theories. Another study revealed that sexual assault offenders are more likely than non-offenders to have high expectations for having sex in a romantic relationship, as well as more positive attitudes about sex, about excuse me, about casual sex. So the next category would be physical and psychological aggression. So this physical aggression occurs in approximately a quarter to half of dating, cohabiting, and married couples. It includes behaviors such as grabbing, pushing, slapping, biting, and then even more serious acts like striking someone that results in injury or death. So physical aggression is strongly associated with sexual assault and rape. A study of married couples conducted in 2002 found that husbands' use of physical aggression strongly predicted their use of sexual assault and rape. A study of rapists in the same year found that of the 120 men who reportedly committed rape, they were responsible for over 1,200 acts of physical aggression. And so, in the same manner, rapists tend to be disproportionately more likely to use physical force in various aspects, not just when it comes to sex. And then psychological aggression is more common form of aggression in intimate relationships than physical aggression, specifically or especially among dating relationships. So there's a wide range of verbal and behavioral acts intended to criticize, humiliate, blame, um, s- to isolate the person away from their social connections so that they don't have a network to fall back on, and that this person can be controlling and domineering. These verbal acts are used to intimidate and threaten one's partner. So, psychological aggression consists of two related components: the expressive aggression, this is the name calling, insulting, humiliation, uh, coercive control. So, these are also things like behaviors intended to monitor and control. For instance, disabling a victim's car, putting GPS trackers on their phone without their knowledge or on the car so that you can monitor where they go. Uh, Psychological aggression has been linked to aggressive sexual beliefs as well. History of violence. So, again, uh, and in this way, we're talking about the when a person has a childhood history of violence. And so, rapists frequently report experiences of physical abuse, uh, witnessing and watching parental violence, emotional abuse, and their own infliction of cruelty to animals. And so, this idea that physical abuse, parental violence, emotional abuse uh, in the early childhood years results in the externalizing behaviors that we see today. Now, of course, all people that were abused as children, watched their parents fight, or were the recipients of emotional abuse don't go on to become violent people when they grow up. It's just a risk factor, right? People who do experience these things are more likely to. It doesn't mean that they will. There are many, in fact, most people that experience these things don't go on to be rapists. So, in a 2004 study found that physical and verbal abuse during childhood led to a variety of antisocial behaviors, not just sexual assault. Callous personality traits, which we've talked about before, right? This low agreeableness, this callousness, which leads to sexual assault, which lead to, all right, so these things can lead to aggressive sexual fantasies, which can be problematic. So, other research has suggested that the combination of physical violence, domestic violence, emotional abuse, and neglect, right, not meeting the needs of someone, predicts subsequent sex offending. Again, it's an increased risk of committing sexual violence, not necessarily a guarantee that someone will. Again, most people that experience these situations don't go on to do this. And so the idea behind these risk factors is that a person who's been raised in such an environment is unable to or less able to identify his emotions or her emotions, and then unable to adapt to those situations. So these people often react to emotionally charged situations in a confused manner or an awkward manner, and sometimes using overt aggression, violence, or frustration, which looks like aggressiveness and violence. The last risk factor category we'll talk about is alcohol use and abuse. So, alcohol use and abuse, which we've discussed before in terms with pornography, the relationship between alcohol and rape is one of the most consistent and strongly held predictors of whether a sexual assault will occur. But it's not necessarily a simple relationship, it's complex. So, in studying whether alcohol consumption increases the severity of the sexual assault, um, it, it does, right? But it moderates. So, increased use of alcohol is related to increased aggression in a simplistic way, but moderate alcohol use was associated with the most severe sexual assaults. And so if you're too drunk to do anything, you are unlikely to commit an assault, right? If you fall down, pass out drunk. And if you're just had a couple of drinks, you still have the ability to control your behavior, but it's this moderate alcohol use that is disinhibiting enough to lead to more severe sexual assaults. Um, so, in addition to other individual risk factors, that um, alcohol, when combined with these, greatly increases the chance that a sexual assault will occur. So, someone who has uh, hostile masculinity and then drinks is much more likely to commit a sexual assault than someone who drinks and doesn't have high base level trait hostility. And so there's a multi level framework that we talk about soon. Uh, the ecological framework, where it talks about individual, community, society, and relational risk factors all working together to increase sexual violence.